The hills of eastern Washington keeps resurfacing. A bottomless pit said to be a pathway to the paranormal.
What if somewhere in the pine forests of Washington state, there is a hole that swallows sound? For decades, it was nothing more than a strange phone call on late-night radio. A story too odd to be true and too specific to be a lie. Then, years later, a small group of explorers finally lowered a camera into it. What came back on that recording spread across the internet in a matter of hours. And then it vanished, along with everyone who filmed it. This is the story of Mel's Hole, and why some people believe it should have stayed buried forever. Long before smartphones, before viral videos, before anyone could verify a strange claim with a quick search, a man who identified himself only as Mel called into a late-night paranormal radio program. He wasn't selling anything. He didn't sound excited or theatrical. He spoke the way someone speaks when they're trying very hard to convince themselves they aren't crazy. Mel said he owned a patch of land outside a small town in central Washington. Somewhere on that property, hidden among the trees, was a hole. Not a sinkhole, not a well, not a mine shaft, something else. He said he had tested it the only way a rural landowner could, by feeding fishing line into it, spool after spool, waiting to hear the telltale sound of it going slack when it finally hit bottom. It never did, according to Mel. He ran out patience somewhere past several miles of line, and the hole never gave him an answer. He said the strangest part wasn't the depth. It was the silence. Drop a rock down a normal hole, and you eventually hear something, a splash, a thud, an echo bouncing off stone. Mel said his hole ate every sound he sent into it. No clatter, no echo, nothing. The station's phone lines lit up. People wanted directions. People wanted proof. Mel gave neither. He hung up, and for years, that was all anyone had, a single recorded voice describing something impossible. What made the call unusual, even among a program built around unusual calls, was how mundane Mel sounded while describing something so strange. He didn't claim to have seen a creature. He didn't claim government agents were already at his door. He described a chore, feeding line into a hole on his own property, the way you might describe checking a well or clearing a drainage ditch, and the horror crept in only through the details he couldn't explain. No bottom, no echo, no debris ever settling anywhere near where it should have. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that animals near the property behaved oddly around the site. Dogs refusing to approach, birds seeming to avoid flying directly over it, as if some instinct older than curiosity was warning them off. It's a kind of detail that's impossible to verify and easy to dismiss, but it's also the kind of detail that sticks with a listener long after the call has ended. He also claimed that people in the area had been using the hole as an informal dumping ground for years before he ever thought to test its depth, old appliances, scrap metal, things too bulky to haul to a landfill. According to Mel, none of it ever made a sound on the way down. No distant clatter, no metallic echo bouncing back up the shaft. Just silence, swallowing whatever went in over and over for years, without anyone in the area apparently thinking much of it until Mel finally said something out loud. Radio callers get forgotten. Strange claims fade into static and are replaced by the next caller's strange claim. But Mel's story didn't fade. It lingered, passed around forums and late-night documentaries, gathering small details every time someone retold it. Locals in the area, it was said, avoided the general region long before Mel ever spoke publicly. Some described a kind of unease that settled over anyone who wandered too close, an instinct to turn back that had nothing to do with terrain or wildlife. Whether that was folklore added after the fact or something older is impossible to say. Stories like this tend to grow their own mythology. What kept people hooked wasn't just the depth of the hole. It was what a bottomless hole implied. Geologists will tell you that a hole with no measurable bottom doesn't fit anywhere in what we know about the Earth's crust. Dig down far enough anywhere on the planet, and you run into heat, pressure, and shifting rock long before you run into nothing. The deepest hole humans have ever managed to drill took decades of dedicated engineering to reach a fraction of the depth Mel claimed to have measured with a fishing rod. If his story was even partially true, it broke rules that shouldn't be breakable. That contradiction is exactly what turned a strange local rumor into a story that has now outlived its original teller. As with any story involving an unexplained hole and a government that stays suspiciously quiet, rumors of interference followed close behind. People who looked into the story claimed that shortly after Mel went public, unfamiliar vehicles were seen parked near the property. Some said access to the land was abruptly restricted, with vague explanations offered and no real details given. Others claimed Mel described being approached and pressured to stay silent, and that he left the country not long after. None of this has ever been confirmed through any official channel, and that's an important thing to sit with. There is no paper trail, no leaked document, no on-record government statement acknowledging the property, the hole, or Mel himself. What exists is testimony, retold secondhand, filtered through decades of retelling on forums and video essays. That doesn't make it worthless as a story, but it does mean we should hold it the way we'd hold any unverified account, as something worth exploring, not something to treat as settled fact. What is true is that Mel disappeared from public life for years. When accounts of him resurfaced, the details had shifted. He reportedly sounded different, hesitant, foggy on specifics he'd once described in vivid detail. He allegedly mentioned a second hole, this time somewhere in the Nevada desert, and hinted that whatever was happening wasn't limited to one patch of forest in Washington. Then he disappeared again, and this time for good. No further sightings. No further calls. Just a story that had grown too large to belong to one man anymore. Every era rediscovers its own ghost stories, and Mel's Hole found new life among people who weren't even born when the original call aired. Old radio clips got trimmed down, subtitled, and re-uploaded with dramatic titles. True crime-style breakdown videos picked the story apart detail by detail. On short-form video platforms, people began treating it less like an old legend and more like an active investigation, something they could personally go find, film, and post about. That shift mattered. A story confined to an old recording is static. A story with a location attached becomes a scavenger hunt. Amateur investigators began comparing Mel's vague, decades-old description of his property to public land records and satellite imagery, trying to narrow down where, exactly, this hole might be. Eventually, someone claimed to have found a patch of land that matched, a strangely bare, perfectly rounded clearing in the middle of dense forest, with no obvious explanation for why nothing grew there. No trail leading in, no trail leading out. Just an empty circle where a forest should have been. Whether that clearing has anything to do with Mel's original story is impossible to confirm. Bare patches in forests can result from soil composition, old burn scars, logging history, or dozens of mundane explanations. But mundane explanations rarely satisfy a story that has already convinced people something extraordinary is being hidden. Once the location spread, it stopped being a story people just watched. People started planning to go there. Online communities built around the story took on the structure of an ongoing investigation rather than a piece of folklore. Timelines were assembled cross-referencing every version of Mel's original account against later retellings, flagging inconsistencies and trying to figure out which details had been embellished over time and which had simply been forgotten and later misremembered. Maps were annotated and re-annotated as new claims about the site's exact location circulated. It became less like sharing a scary story around a fire and more like a slow-moving, crowdsourced case file, with new contributors adding fragments of information every few months, keeping the thread alive long after any single post would have normally faded into irrelevance. Interestingly, the renewed attention also brought out skeptics, whose voices had never really been part of the original radio-era version of the story. Geologists and hobbyist debunkers made their own videos explaining, patiently, why a hole of the depth Mel described simply couldn't exist according to everything we understand about the Earth's crust. Their arguments were sound, grounded in real data about heat gradients and rock pressure at depth. And yet, oddly, the debunking didn't kill the story, it fed it. Every well-reasoned explanation for why the hole couldn't be real became, in the eyes of believers, one more reason to ask why so much effort was being spent trying to convince people of that in the first place. What separated the more recent chapter of this story from every version before it was the seriousness of the people chasing it. This wasn't a handful of teenagers with flashlights daring each other to walk further into the woods. Small groups began showing up with real field equipment. Drones rated for rough conditions, thermal cameras, ground-penetrating sensors, and cable rigs built specifically for a controlled, monitored descent. Some had backgrounds in engineering. Some had done field work before, chasing other unexplained locations around the world. They weren't interested in ghost stories. They wanted data. Multiple groups reportedly made the trip out to the area over time, and the reports that came back were strange in a quieter way than the legend itself. GPS devices behaving erratically near the site. Drone signals cutting in and out for no clear reason. A handful of people describing an odd pressure or heaviness in their chest while standing near the clearing. The kind of sensation that's easy to dismiss as nerves and hard to dismiss when several unrelated people report the same thing independently. None of this is proof of anything supernatural. Unreliable GPS and signal interference can happen for perfectly ordinary reasons in remote terrain, but it was enough to keep people curious, and curious people eventually stop taking notes and start dropping cameras. The most talked about attempt happened with a small focus team. 5 people, a custom rig built to withstand pressure and temperature extremes, and a camera engineered for low light and thermal recording. They weren't chasing views. According to accounts that later circulated, they deliberately avoided streaming live, choosing instead to document everything privately and review it afterward, treating the whole operation less like content and more like a genuine field investigation. The descent itself, by every account, started uneventfully. The camera fed back a steady, high-quality signal as it dropped past the first several hundred feet. The tunnel walls, if that's the right word for them, appeared unnaturally smooth, worn in a way that didn't look like water erosion or typical rock formation. No debris, no roots breaking through, no signs that anything organic had ever touched those walls. Just uninterrupted, quiet stones sliding past the lens. Then the anomalies began. Temperature readings that should have climbed the deeper the camera went instead dropped sharply, colder than the equipment's baseline calibration accounted for. Somewhere past the 400-foot mark, faint pulses of light appeared on camera. With no obvious source, brief, rhythmic flashes that some viewers later described as looking almost like a heartbeat rendered in light. Magnetic sensors on the rig recorded fluctuations that had no clear cause, and the drone's compass readout became unreliable, drifting as though the space around it no longer behaved the way space should. Then, at just under 600 feet, something appeared in frame. Described by those present as a tall, narrow, motionless shape positioned between the lens and the tunnel wall. It didn't move toward the camera or away from it. It was simply there, holding still for the few seconds of footage that exist before the feed cut to black entirely. The equipment lost signal. When the team reeled the line back in, the camera was gone, the housing detached from a cable, as though it had simply come apart. The recovered footage, the portion that existed before the blackout, eventually made its way online, and it spread with the kind of speed that only genuinely unsettling, ambiguous footage manages to achieve. Viewers pored over every frame. The temperature drop became a talking point among people trying to apply real physics to an impossible situation. The rhythmic light bursts were slowed down, sharpened, and picked apart by amateur analysts convinced they were looking at some kind of pattern, maybe even a signal. The low hum that appeared on the audio track around the same depth as the light burst was run through spectrogram software by more than one curious viewer, with some claiming to hear voice-like patterns buried in the distortion, a claim that's easy to make and very hard to verify, since the human brain is remarkably good at finding patterns, especially in ambiguous noise. And then there was the shape. Slowed down, zoomed in, adjusted for contrast. It became the single most debated frame of the entire video. Some viewers were convinced it was a simple visual artifact, a trick of low light and compression on a fast-moving camera. Others were certain it was something standing there, waiting, aware of the camera, in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. As the footage spread, so did stranger reports. People who reposted the video described accounts being suspended without clear explanation. Others claimed the file corrupted the moment they tried to download or re-upload it. A few said they received takedown requests from unfamiliar, unnamed sources, with no clear legal standing. It's worth being honest here. None of these claims have been independently verified, and viral videos generate rumors about censorship almost as reliably as they generate the views themselves. But true or exaggerated, the rumors became part of the story, feeding the sense that something about this particular hole did not want to be seen. What happened after the video spread is, in some ways, the eeriest part of the entire story, not because of anything supernatural, but because of how quietly everything just stopped. The team that recorded the footage went silent. No follow-up posts, no interviews, no further attempts to return to the site. People who tried reaching out to them described unanswered messages and disconnected numbers. Mirrors of the video across different platforms began disappearing, some through vague copyright claims that never seemed to trace back to an actual rights holder. Around the same time, reports emerged that the wooded area near the rumored location had been fenced off, with satellite imagery of the clearing growing suspiciously blurred, similar to how sensitive government sites are sometimes obscured on public mapping tools. People passing near the area described unfamiliar vehicles and unmarked personnel. Though, as with the earlier claims about Mel, none of this has ever been confirmed by any official source. No agency has acknowledged owning the land, restricting access to it, or investigating anything unusual there. The silence itself became the loudest part of the story, and Mel himself was never heard from again. No further calls, no further sightings, nothing beyond second-hand claims that he'd once hinted at a third hole somewhere else entirely, something even larger and older than the first two. Whether that's true, embellished, or invented outright somewhere along the story's long chain of retellings, no one can say for certain. What's left is a legend with no clean ending, a story that keeps circulating precisely because it refuses to resolve. It's worth saying plainly, nothing in this story has been independently verified. There's no confirmed land record proving Mel's property exists, as described, no peer-reviewed analysis of the recovered footage, no official statement from any government agency about the region in question. What exists is decades of retelling, a handful of unverified expeditions, and one deeply strange piece of footage that continues to circulate in fragments. That doesn't make the story meaningless. Legends like this endure because they sit right at the edge of what feels possible, close enough to plausible that people want to believe there's something to it, vague enough that no one can definitively prove there isn't. Mel's Hole has survived nearly 3 decades because every attempt to explain it away leaves just enough unanswered to keep the question alive. Maybe one day someone will return to that clearing with better equipment, better documentation, and actually get answers. Or maybe the story will keep doing what it's always done, resurfacing every few years, gathering a new audience, and disappearing again just as quickly, leaving behind nothing but a bare patch of forest and a question nobody can quite let go of. What, if anything, is actually down there? If this story kept you hooked, let us know what you think really happened down in that hole. And stick around, because the next mystery we're diving into might be even harder to explain.